The applause was a deafening roar, a wall of noise that seemed to push the air right out of the room, masking the sharp, desperate gasp as Julianne's knees finally gave way. I stepped forward, a frantic, jagged lunge to catch the woman I loved, but I was a fraction of a second too late. Or perhaps I was simply years too late. Before my hands could even graze the silk of her blouse, she was already there. Clara didn't just catch Julianne, she absorbed the collapse. It was seamless, a physical instinct honed over decades of proximity. I stood frozen, my arms empty and useless, watching my lover fall into a safety I hadn't built. The gallery track lighting seemed to flare brighter, illuminating not just the medical emergency, but the stark, blinding reality of my exclusion. The gallery was a high-stakes arena of white walls and ruthless judgment, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume, dry champagne, and the ozone smell of critical ambition. Julianne had spent the last year pouring her marrow into these canvases, raw, exposing pieces of crimson and charcoal that demanded everything from her. And now that she had given it, she was hollowed out. I watched from the periphery, that specific purgatory where the new lover stands, just outside the blast radius of the crisis. Clara was the epicenter. She was on her knees on the polished concrete, holding Julianne against her chest with a stability that felt less like a reaction and more like a geological fact. They moved like binary stars, rotating around a center of gravity established long before I ever walked into Julianne's life. I watched the way Clara's hand moved, sliding up the back of Julianne's neck to tangle fingers into the damp hair at the base of her skull. It was a possessive gesture. Not sexual exactly. I knew Julianne. I trusted the fidelity of our bed. But it was intimate in a way that made my own skin prickle with a heat I couldn't name. It was the intimacy of someone who knows the exact pressure required to keep a person from shattering. There was a faint past ambiguity in the way Clara held her, a lingering protective heat that suggested they had once been more than this, or perhaps were simply more than anyone else could ever be. I stepped closer, the soles of my boots squeaking aggressively in the hushed room. Is she breathing? I need to call an ambulance. My voice sounded tinny, brittle against the heavy silence of their connection. Clara didn't even look up. Her eyes were fixed on Julianne's pale face, her expression calm, terrifyingly knowing. She's breathing, Sarah. She just forgot how for a second. Clara's voice was a low hum that vibrated against Julianne's temple. She does this when the adrenaline crashes. Just give her a minute. She does this. The present tense struck me like a physical blow. It implied a pattern, a recurring cycle of collapse and rescue that I was completely ignorant of. I was the interruption here. I watched Julianne's face pressed into the crook of Clara's shoulder. The fabric of Clara's blazer was rough, structured wool, a stark contrast to Julianne's fluid silk. But Julianne burrowed into it like it was the only soft thing in the world. I could see the tension leaving Julianne's body, draining out of her not because of my presence, but because of the specific rhythm of Clara's heartbeat against her ear. I reached out, finally making contact, placing my hand on Julianne's arm. Jules, I'm here. Julianne didn't pull away, but she didn't lean into me either. She stayed folded into the dark wool of Clara's coat. It was Clara who shifted, angling her body slightly to block me. Not aggressively, but with the mindless biological imperative of a guard dog. We need to get her out of here, Clara commanded, looking at me for the first time. Her eyes were dry and clear. The crowd is suffocating her. Grab her purse. I was relegated to logistics. I stood there, holding the leather strap of my lover's bag, watching the woman I slept with being hauled upright by the woman who held her history. The jealousy that rose in my throat wasn't about sex. It wasn't about the physical act of touching. It was about the effortlessness. It was the way their bodies fit together like two pieces of the same fractured stone. As we moved the crisis from the public floor toward the exit, the gallery patrons parting like water around them, I followed in their wake. I was the girlfriend, the partner, the one with the title. But watching Clara stroke the hair away from Julianne's damp forehead, I knew I was just a tourist in the landscape of their intimacy. We moved the crisis from the public floor to the private sanctuary of a nearby cafe. a place where the lights were dim enough to hide the tremors still racking Julianne's hands. It was raining now, hard sheets of water streaking the plate glass, blurring the city lights into smears of neon. The atmosphere inside was thick, smelling of damp wool, bitter espresso, and the kind of hushed intimacy that usually belongs to lovers. The seating arrangement was a declaration of war I hadn't realized we were fighting. The booth was a curved crescent of cracked red leather. Logic dictated I sit next to my girlfriend, or perhaps we sandwich her between us. But Clara moved with the fluidity of water, sliding in first and pulling Julianne down immediately beside her. They sat shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, a closed circuit of body heat and history. I was left with the hard wooden chair on the opposite side of the small marble table, separated from them by a barrier of cold stone. I watched the body-forward comfort between them, with a growing knot in my stomach. It wasn't just that they were close. It was the way their bodies seemed to lack boundaries. Under the table, I saw Clara's knee press firmly against Julianne's, locking them together. It wasn't a flirtatious graze. It was structural. Julianne leaned into it, her body slumping sideways until her head rested near Clara's shoulder, her face turned toward Clara's neck. "It's the come down," Clara murmured, not to me, but to the top of Julianne's head. Her hand came up to cup Julianne's jaw, her thumb tracing the line of the bone with a familiarity that made my breath catch. "Remember the Berlin winter? The exhibition in that freezing warehouse?" Julianne let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "The heater broke, and we stayed up for 3 days straight to finish the installation," Clara finished, her voice dropping to a register that excluded the rest of the room. "You were shaking, just like this. I had to feed you soup in the bathtub because you couldn't hold the spoon." I sat there, gripping my cold coffee cup, listening to the shorthand of a decade I hadn't lived. I didn't know about Berlin. I didn't know about the bathtub. I was a stranger to the raw, unpolished version of Julianne that Clara held so effortlessly. I tried to interject, to claim my territory. "She should probably eat something now," I said, my voice too loud in the intimate bubble they had created. "Jules, do you want a croissant?" Julianne didn't even open her eyes. She just burrowed deeper into Clara's coat. Clara looked at me then, her expression unreadable. "She can't eat yet, Sarah. Her stomach cramps when she crashes. She just needs quiet." I was silenced by the authority of her knowledge. I watched the way Clara's breath hitched slightly when Julianne shifted, pressing her chest against Clara's side. It was a tiny, involuntary sound, a gasp of awareness that betrayed the faint past ambiguity between them. Had they been lovers in Berlin? Had they shared that bathtub? The question burned in my throat. Clara's hold was protective, yes, but it possessed a lingering, possessive heat. She held Julianne not just like a friend, but like something that belonged to her, something she had temporarily loaned out to me and was now reclaiming. I felt a specific burn of jealousy. Not of sex exactly, but of the texture of their bond. I was jealous of the damp wool smell of Clara's coat that Julianne was inhaling. I was jealous of the way Clara knew exactly where to press her fingers into Julianne's neck to release the tension. I was jealous of the silence between them, which was heavy with words they didn't need to speak. It was the effortlessness that hurt the most. When the night finally ended and we stood on the wet pavement outside, the separation felt violent. Clara hugged Julianne goodbye, a lingering, full-body embrace where hands pressed into backs and cheeks pressed against temples. "Call me if she can't sleep," Clara said to me, her tone professional, yet condescendingly helpful. "I know the drill." "I've got it," I said, my voice sharp. But as we drove away, the shadow of that closeness followed me home. I looked at Julianne in the passenger seat, asleep against the cold window, and realized that while I was taking her home, part of her had stayed back in the rain with Clara. 3 days later, I let myself into Julianne's studio, seeking a version of her that didn't feel shared. The space was a converted industrial loft, high-ceilinged and echoing, a physical manifesto of her internal chaos. It smelled aggressively of turpentine, linseed oil, and the dusty, sweet decay of dried flowers she hung from the rafters to study for texture. This was supposed to be the one place where the world couldn't touch her, where the demands of the gallery and the critics and the audience fell away. I wanted to believe it was a sanctuary, where I could finally be the primary inhabitant. I was early, and Julianne was late. I wandered through the maze of canvases, stepping over drop cloths stained with the history of her last collection. The air here was usually cold, but today it felt heavy, stagnant with the weight of things left unfinished. In the corner, pushed under a trestle table loaded with mixing jars, I found a stack of old sketchbooks. They weren't the sleek, black-bound ones she used now. These were battered, their spines cracked, the cardboard covers peeling at the corners. They looked like artifacts from a time before she knew how to protect herself. I shouldn't have opened them. The privacy of an artist's sketchbook is a specific kind of sacred, but I was hungry for a clue, for some map to the terrain of her heart that I couldn't seem to navigate. I opened the top one. It wasn't just art. It was devotion. Page after page was filled with studies of the same subject. I recognized the hands first. Long fingers, square nails, a specific scar on the thumb knuckle. Clara's hands. Julianne had drawn them holding a coffee cup, gripping a steering wheel, resting dormant on a knee. The charcoal was smudged, worked over with an obsessive attention to shadow and weight. I turned the page. The curve of a neck, the hair pulled up in a messy knot, exposing the vulnerability of the spine. It was Clara's neck. I knew it because I had spent the last 3 nights staring at the back of it while she walked away from us. The realization hit me with the precision of a surgical cut. Clara wasn't just a friend who had supported the artist. She was the foundation the art was built on. These weren't casual sketches. They were love letters written in graphite. They captured a level of intimacy that made my own relationship with Julianne feel like a rough draft. Julianne had memorized the topography of Clara's body long before she had ever learned my name. I stood there, surrounded by the smell of paint and dust, feeling the ghosts of their history rising up from the paper to choke me. The heavy metal door slid open with a groan, startling me. Julianne walked in, shaking rain from her coat, her cheeks flushed with the cold. She stopped when she saw me, her eyes dropping immediately to the sketchbook in my hands. "Sarah," she said, the air charging instantly between us. She didn't ask what I was doing. She didn't apologize. She just stood there, beautiful and disheveled, bringing the scent of the storm into the chemical tang of the room. I closed the book, the sound sharp in the quiet space. "I was just looking at your early work." "That's not work," she said, her voice low, walking toward me. "That's practice." "It looks like muscle memory," I countered, my voice tighter than I intended. Julianne closed the distance. She didn't argue, she didn't explain. She simply stepped into my space, her presence overwhelming the ghosts I had just conjured. She reached out, her hands paint-stained and cold, and cupped my face. The proximity was intoxicating. "You're here now," she whispered, her thumb brushing my lip. "I'm looking at you." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to erase the charcoal lines with the reality of my own skin. I leaned into her, my hands finding the waist of her jeans, pulling her body flush against mine. The kiss was hungry, a desperate attempt to claim territory, to overwrite the history with the immediate, undeniable heat of the present. I felt the tension in her frame, the way she melted into the embrace, her breath hitching against my mouth. For a moment, the studio belonged to us. Then a phone buzzed. It wasn't a call. It was a single, sharp vibration from the table where she'd tossed her bag. Julianne froze. The reaction was involuntary, a biological flinch. She broke the kiss, her eyes darting toward the sound before she could stop herself. The screen lit up, casting a pale blue glow in the dim room. Clara. The name was a barrier, a wall of glass and expectation dropping between us. Julianne didn't check it, but the damage was done. The digital interruption felt as heavy as a physical hand on my shoulder, pushing me back, reminding me that even in the sanctuary of her creation, the signal from the past was always stronger than the noise of the present. The dinner was my calculated attempt at a boundary line drawn in saffron risotto and an expensive Barolo. I wanted to claim territory in the one place I technically owned, my apartment. I wanted to prove that while Clara might own the past, I could curate the present with a sophistication that the starving artist narrative couldn't touch. I invited 2 other friends to dilute the intensity, to turn a triangle into a party. But from the moment Clara walked in, the geometry shifted. She didn't bring a host gift. She brought a bottle of cheap, harsh whiskey that Julianne's eyes immediately softened at. A talisman from a time when they drank to forget the cold, not to savor the notes. Clara dominated the conversation, not with malice, but with the sheer, crushing weight of shared chronology. She sat at the head of my table, despite me placing her on the side, and spun the air into a tapestry of the wild years. It was a performance of exclusion. Every anecdote began with, "Remember when we," and ended with a look at Julianne that shut the rest of us out like a door slamming in a face. "You have to understand," Clara said, pouring the whiskey into my crystal wine glasses, ignoring the wine I'd breathed for an hour. "We didn't have heat in that loft for 2 winters. The landlord was this ancient guy who thought art kept you warm." Julianne laughed, a sound that was looser, younger than the laugh she gave me. "I burned 3 of my best canvases in the wood stove, just to keep your fingers from freezing." "You did," Clara agreed, leaning forward, her elbows on the table, invading the centerpiece I had arranged. "That's love, Sarah. Burning your masterpiece so your best friend can feel her hands enough to hold a brush." I smiled, but the muscles in my face felt tight, like wire. "It sounds intense." "It was survival," Clara corrected, her voice dropping to that intimate register that made the room feel suddenly small. "We had 1 mattress, a single. We found it on the street." She looked at Julianne, her gaze unflinching, stripping away the comfort of my heated apartment, my food, my presence. "Do you remember the February freeze? The pipes burst." "I remember," Julianne whispered. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Clara's hands. "We slept in our coats," Clara told the table, but she was speaking only to Julianne. "We slept wrapped around each other like puppies in a box. I had to hold your feet against my stomach to stop you from losing a toe. We didn't move for 12 hours at a time. I knew the rhythm of your shivering better than I knew my own heartbeat." The ambiguity of it sat in the center of the table, heavier than the roast. Were they lovers? The story was framed as survival, as the desperate platonic huddling of 2 broke students against the elements. But the way Clara described it, the feet against stomach, the wrapped around each other, carried a sensory load that was unmistakably erotic in its intimacy. It wasn't about sex, it was about the erasure of space. It was about a time when their bodies were the only things keeping each other alive. I watched Julianne's face soften, the lines of stress from the gallery show smoothing out into a look of absolute, terrifying trust. She looked at Clara not as a friend, but as a lifeline. I felt the jealousy shift in my chest. It wasn't the sharp, hot spike of annoyance anymore. It settled into something deeper, a cold, aching fear of inadequacy. How could I compete with that? I could offer her warmth, yes. I could offer her a bed with high thread count sheets and a thermostat set to 72. But I couldn't offer her the memory of saving her life with my own body heat. I couldn't offer her the sacred trauma of that poverty. "We were a single organism back then," Clara said, taking a sip of the whiskey, her eyes finally flicking to me. There was no challenge in them, just a calm statement of fact. "You can't undo that kind of proximity. It changes your DNA." "We're not freezing anymore, though," I said, my voice sounding petty even to my own ears. "We have heat now." Clara smiled, a slow, knowing expression that made me feel like a child interrupting a conversation between adults. "Yes," she said, "you have heat, but you don't know what it's like to need it." The laughter from the other guests had died down moments ago, suffocated by the density of the history being displayed. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum. It was the sound of a question hanging in the air, unanswered and heavy, begging to be filled with a truth that none of us were brave enough to speak. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday, disguised as a standard email notification at 8:14 p.m. We were in the kitchen, the domestic air between us comfortable and settled, smelling of the garlic and lemon from the dinner I was preparing. Julianne was leaning against the granite counter, scrolling idly through her phone, her body relaxed in a way that I had started to claim as my own victory. Then the screen lit up with the decision from the foundation. It was the residency she had pinned her next 2 years on, the funding, the studio space in Florence, the validation that she wasn't just shouting into the void. She didn't speak. She just made a sound, a sharp, wet intake of breath that sucked all the oxygen out of the room. I turned from the stove, the wooden spoon still in my hand, and saw her face. It had gone gray, the blood draining away so fast it looked like a physical injury. She dropped the phone onto the counter with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. "Jules?" I dropped the spoon and moved toward her. My instinct was immediate and territorial. I wanted to be the container for this grief. I wanted to wrap my arms around her, to pull her into the heat of my chest and absorb the shock. I reached for her, my hands aiming for her shoulders, my body curving to create a shelter. "What happened? Talk to me." She flinched. It wasn't a subtle hesitation. It was a recoil. Her body snapped back from my touch, as if I were made of burning wire. She twisted away, her shoulder hitting the cabinet with a dull thud, her hands coming up not to hold me, but to ward me off. "Don't," she choked out. "I can't. Not right now." I froze, my hands hovering in the empty air between us. The rejection was somatic, a reflex that bypassed her brain entirely. She didn't look at me. She looked at the phone. Her hand scrambled for it, fingers shaking so badly she dropped it once before gripping it like a lifeline. She didn't look for me to solve it. She didn't look for me to hold her. She unlocked the screen and pressed a single speed dial button. I stood there, the intruder in my own kitchen, and watched her press the phone to her ear with a desperation that made my own heart stall. "Pick up," she whispered, her eyes squeezed shut, her back turned to me. "Please, pick up." The line connected. I didn't hear a greeting, but I saw the change. It was instantaneous. The rigid, brittle tension in Julianne's spine dissolved. She slid down the front of the cabinets until she was sitting on the floor, knees pulled to her chest. The phone pressed so hard against her ear, the skin turned white. "They gave it to the guy from Yale," Julianne said. Her voice broke, shattering into a sob that was raw and ugly and completely unselfconscious. "It's gone, Clara. The whole thing is gone." I stood by the stove, listening to the silence of the room, punctuated only by the tinny, rhythmic murmur of Clara's voice on the other end. I couldn't hear the words, but I heard the cadence. It was low, steady, a continuous stream of sound that acted like a sedative. I watched my lover's breathing sink to that voice. I watched her forehead rest against her knees, her body curling inward, seeking a comfort that was thousands of miles away electronically, but right there, in every way that mattered. Clara didn't need to ask what residency. She didn't need to ask why it mattered. She didn't need to be told about the 3 years of grant applications, the specific hope Julianne had buried in that proposal, or the terror of being 34 and still waiting for permission to exist. Clara knew. She held the context. I was new. I was the person who brought her coffee and made her dinner and warmed her bed, but I was a tourist in her grief. I didn't know the landscape of her failures. I didn't know the specific geography of this pain. Julianne nodded at something Clara said, a fresh wave of tears spilling over. But these were different. These were the tears of release. "I know," Julianne whispered into the phone. "I know you told me. I know." I realized then, with a clarity that was colder than the rain outside, that I could stand here for 100 years with my arms open, and I would never be able to offer the specific frequency of comfort she was getting from that phone. I was the present, but the grief belonged to the past, and the past belonged to Clara. I turned off the burner under the dinner that neither of us would eat. The click of the dial was loud, but Julianne didn't hear it. She was gone, transported to a place where I couldn't follow, held in the arms of a ghost voice that knew exactly how to hold her together. I walked out of the kitchen, the sound of her weeping following me down the hall, and closed the bedroom door. I couldn't stay in the room and watch my own irrelevance. She found me an hour later. The bedroom was dark, lit only by the street lamps filtering through the blinds, casting prison bar shadows across the duvet. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, not reading, not scrolling, just waiting for the inevitable collision. When she opened the door, the light from the hallway cut a sharp rectangle across the floor, exposing my stillness. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed, her posture retaining the ghost of that slump against the kitchen cabinets. She smelled like crying, that specific salt-heavy scent of released tension. "Sarah," she started, her voice raspy. "I'm sorry. Don't," I said. My voice was calm, which was the most terrifying thing about it. "Don't tell me you just needed a minute. You didn't need a minute. You needed her." She stepped into the room, closing the door, sealing us in with the accusation. "She knows the context, Sarah. She knows what that residency meant. I didn't have to explain it from scratch." "I didn't ask you to explain it," I countered, standing up. The movement was sharp, a physical punctuation mark in the dim room. "I asked you to let me hold you, and you flinched. You looked at me like I was a stranger trying to touch you on the subway." Julianne leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms, a defensive posture I was beginning to hate. "It wasn't about you. It was a reflex. Clara has been there for every rejection letter since I was 19. It's muscle memory." "That's exactly the problem," I said, stepping into the light. "I am fighting a ghost that I can't see, but who apparently owns the lease on your nervous system. I'm not jealous that you have a history, Jules. I'm not jealous that you slept in a coat together or shared a bathtub in Berlin. I'm jealous that when you bleed, you don't think I'm capable of stitching you up." "That's not fair," she whispered, but her eyes dropped. "It is entirely fair," I pressed, the anger finally vibrating in my chest, hot and necessary. "You have given her a monopoly on your vulnerability. You give me the dinner parties and the gallery openings and the sex. You give me the shiny, successful version of yourself. But the moment something breaks, the moment you're actually real, you deport me. You send me out of the room so you can be real with her." Julianne pushed off the door, her own temper flaring. "Because she doesn't need me to be impressive. She remembers when I was nothing. With you, I feel like I have to keep earning my place. I have to be the artist you admire. With Clara, I can just be the failure." "I don't want the artist," I said, my voice dropping, heavy with the truth of it. "I want the failure. I want the mess. I want the version of you that slides down kitchen cabinets and can't breathe." I walked over to her, stopping just outside touching distance. The air between us was thick, static charged. "I don't need to be your past, Julianne. I can't be. I can't retroactively freeze with you in an unheated loft. But I have to be your primary comfort in the present. If I'm not the first call when the world ends, then I'm not your partner. I'm just your audience." She looked up at me then, her expression fracturing. "It's hard," she admitted, the words pulling out of her like teeth. "It's hard to let someone new see the ugly parts when the old parts are so safe. She's the archive. She holds the proof that I survived." "I know she is," I said, and I meant it. I wasn't trying to burn the archive. "But you can't live in a museum. You have to live here, with me. And I can't be with someone who trusts a voice on the phone more than the hands reaching for her in her own kitchen." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the dust of the boundary I had just drawn. It was an ultimatum, not of leaving, but of depth. I watched her process it. I watched the safety of her history warring with the risk of our future. She looked at me, really looked at me, stripping away the layers of expectation. She saw the cost of her safety for the first time. She saw that by protecting herself from my comfort, she was actively starving us. "I didn't know," she whispered, "that I was keeping you out." "You weren't just keeping me out," I said, finally reaching out to touch her hand, feeling the coldness of her skin. "You were keeping her in the center." The text came 3 days later, a digital white flag blinking on my screen at 2 p.m. on a Saturday. "I need you to see something. Please come." It wasn't a request for rescue. It was an invitation. I walked to her studio with my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The rain had cleared, leaving the city scoured and bright, the light unforgiving. When I pushed open the heavy metal door, the air didn't smell like the stale, dusty shrine to the past I had visited before. It smelled sharp, chemical, and alive. The scent of fresh varnish and wet oil paint. The smell of creation happening in real time. Julianne was standing in the center of the room, wiping her hands on a rag that was already stiff with pigment. She looked wrecked, in the beautiful, specific way artists look when they have emptied themselves out. Hair tied back in a knot that was defying gravity, a smear of phthalo blue on her cheekbone like a bruise, her eyes bright and feverish. She didn't say hello. She just pointed to the far wall, where a massive canvas rested on the easel, catching the northern light. I walked toward it, my boots echoing on the concrete, feeling the shift in the room's gravity. The sketches of Clara were gone, cleared from the tables, filed away in the archives where history belongs. In their place was this. It was me. But it wasn't a vanity portrait. It wasn't a soft, romanticized version of a girlfriend. It was a study of hunger. She had painted me standing in the doorway of the bedroom, the way I had looked during the fight. Spine rigid, hands clenched, eyes dark with the specific, terrifying demand to be seen. The colors were violent and tender all at once. Deep indigos and burnt umbers, the shadows heavy, but the light hitting my face was gold. It was a painting of a woman drawing a line in the sand. It was a painting of a woman who refused to be a ghost. I couldn't get it out of my head, Julianne said, her voice coming from right behind me. I hadn't heard her move. The way you looked at me, you were so solid. You weren't trying to save me. You were demanding that I save myself. I turned to face her. The distance between us was negligible. I could see the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. I could smell the turpentine and the sweat and the underlying warm scent of her skin. A smell that was entirely hers, unmediated by memory. You painted the fight, I said, my voice quiet. I painted the moment I woke up, she corrected. She dropped the rag, her hands hanging open at her sides, exposed. Clara is the foundation, Sarah. You were right. She's the reason I survived the cold. But you can't live in a foundation. You have to build a house on top of it. You have to live in the rooms above ground. She took a step closer, breaking the personal space barrier. But this time, it wasn't a collapse. It was a decision. She didn't fall into me. She leaned. She placed her hands on my waist, the tips of her fingers pressing into the fabric of my shirt with deliberate, heavy intent. It was a body-forward intimacy, a claiming. She brought her forehead to rest against mine, her eyes closing, her breath mingling with mine in the narrow space between our mouths. I'm here, she whispered, the words vibrating against my skin. I'm not in Berlin. I'm not in the past. I'm right here, in this room, with you. I brought my hands up to her back, feeling the heat of her through the thin cotton of her paint-stained t-shirt. I felt the tension in her shoulders, not the frantic tension of a crisis, but the humming tension of desire, of presence. I ran my hands down her spine, tracing the vertebrae, grounding her. This wasn't the seamless, practiced fit she had with Clara. This was new. It was jagged and real and high stakes. It felt like the wet paint on the canvas, messy, vibrant, and capable of becoming anything. I see you, I said, pressing a kiss to her temple, tasting the salt on her skin. She let out a long, shuddering breath and pressed her body flush against mine, her weight settling into me not as a burden, but as an anchor. The air in the studio changed then, clearing the scent of old turpentine for something fresh, something that smelled like rain and risk and the terrifying, beautiful promise of the present tense. The second opening was quieter. It wasn't the sterile, white box cathedral of the first gallery. This was a private viewing in a converted brownstone, the walls lined with the new series, the Hunger series. The air didn't smell like ozone and judgment this time. It smelled of warm cedar, fresh rain, and the heavy, expensive red wine being poured in the corner. I stood near the back, leaning against a pillar, watching Julianne navigate the room. She was wearing velvet tonight, a deep midnight blue that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. She looked solid, anchored in the present. Clara was there, of course. You don't erase a decade of history just because you've started building a new floor. But the physics of the room had shifted. In the first gallery, they were binary stars, orbiting each other so closely that no one else could breathe their air. Tonight, Clara stood near the window, a glass of wine in her hand, talking to a collector. She was 10 feet away from Julianne. It might as well have been a mile. The invisible tether that used to snap Julianne back to her side at the first sign of distress had been lengthened, slackened, rendered obsolete. When Julianne finished her brief speech, her voice steady, her hands clear of tremors, the applause was warm, intimate. This was the moment. The adrenaline drop, the crash. I felt my own body tense, a phantom reflex, waiting for the collapse. I watched her shoulders drop an inch. I saw the familiar glaze of exhaustion wash over her eyes. In the old world, this was when Clara would have materialized. She would have been there with the water, the hand on the neck, the whisper in the ear. I saw Clara look up. She saw the shift in Julianne's posture. Her body tensed, the old instinct flaring to life. She took a half step forward, but Julianne didn't look for her. Across the crowded room, through the haze of perfume and conversation, Julianne's eyes found mine. They didn't panic, they didn't plead, they just locked on. It was a visual anchor. She took a breath, steadied herself against the podium, and then she walked. She didn't stumble toward safety. She walked toward me. When she reached me, she didn't collapse. She stepped into my space with intention. The embrace wasn't a rescue. It was a homecoming. I felt the specific weight of her body settling against mine, the heavy velvet of her jacket rough against my silk blouse. I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her in until there was no light between us. I could feel the thrum of her heart against my chest. Not the frantic, bird-like fluttering of the panic attack, but a strong, steady rhythm that was beating in time with mine. "I'm okay," she breathed against my neck, her nose brushing the sensitive skin below my ear. "I just needed to be near you." "I've got you," I whispered back, my hands splaying across her back, claiming the space. Over her shoulder, I saw Clara. She had stopped that half step forward. She was watching us, her expression unreadable for a moment. And then, slowly, it softened. It wasn't a look of defeat. It was a look of relief. She raised her glass slightly in my direction, a silent toast, a passing of the torch. She saw the way Julianne was standing on her own 2 feet, supported by my arms but not carried by them. She saw that the history was still there, but it was no longer the only thing keeping the building standing. The unspoken history settled into the background noise of the party, no longer burning, just existing, like the hum of the city outside. The proximity finally felt like a promise kept. The gallery emptied slowly, leaving just the 2 of us in the quiet space. A final sensory detail anchored the moment, the sound of rain against the roof, sealing us in. Julianne rested her head on my shoulder, a choice, not a reflex. The door clicked shut behind her. There was no going back now. If you've ever had to fight for your place in someone's heart, subscribe for more stories of the quiet wars we win.